Okay, folks, let's talk about bias and sampling. 1.5. 1.5. Okay. So remember, let's see. Remember, we have a population of interest. I keep drawing the same picture over and over again. We have a population of interest. Can't talk to everyone. So we take a subset of that population. We take a sample, and hopefully our sample is representative of that population. But when it's not, then we call that sampling bias. So we want our sample to be representative of the population, and when it's not, we call that sampling bias. So our sample does not perfectly represent the population. So that's why we do all those different techniques from the previous section, is because we want our sample to reflect the population as much as possible. And the only way to do that is ideally with a simple random sample. But if you can't do that, then you try cluster sampling or stratified sampling, stuff like that. Okay, so sampling bias is just when our sample does not correctly reflect our population. So convenience sampling often has a lot of sampling bias. So let's say we were outside of a supermarket back in the day, asking people as they left the supermarket how they felt about a certain new proposition. That seems like a good idea, but who are we missing? Who is not coming out of a supermarket? I'm not sure. Maybe really wealthy people who get their groceries delivered online. This is back in the day when most people didn't do that. So there might be some undercoverage. We might be missing people if we're doing convenience sampling. In my example, outside of a supermarket back in the day, who's not coming out of the supermarket to be asked? Really wealthy people who have their groceries delivered. Okay, so that would be undercoverage. We're not seeing how the wealthier folks feel. There's this term non-response bias. So let's say I were to send out a questionnaire to married couples, and it's just a simple question of, do you think most people are happily married? So most people would just throw that questionnaire into the trash. So you have to ask yourself, well, who are these people that refuse to respond? Who are the non-response? Those are people who probably are perfectly happily married and think this is just a stupid questionnaire. And who would respond? People who are probably very upset in their marriage, or people who are just way too excited about it. So we always need to be concerned about who is it that does not respond to our questionnaire. Who is in this non-response bias? Who in the population are we not accounting for? Looks like I need a new pen. And then there's response bias. So sometimes we get answers, but it's not really how the person truly feels. So do me a favor, make sure to read that whole section in the book. I'll go over it really quickly. So sometimes on phone interviewers, it's important that the interviewer be very professional. Sometimes an interviewer's tone can sort of imply something to the person being surveyed, sort of how they want them to answer. People like pleasing people. So if your interviewer has extreme opinions, it might come off when they're asking people about certain issues. So be wary of interviewers who aren't professionally trained. Sometimes people misrepresented answers. Sometimes people lie. Sometimes you can ask people a stupid question like, do you cheat on your taxes? No. Of course everyone's going to say no. Another example of a misrepresented answer is, let's say we're trying to figure out how tall an average male is at our college. You may want to measure them up against the wall rather than ask them, because every guy is probably going to say 6 feet, even though he's not. So people will lie. Or maybe dumb questions like, have you ever cheated on your spouse? Of course, everyone's going to say no. So sometimes people are not honest. Wording of questions. So right now, we're kind of under this quarantine. If you were to call up folks and ask, are you for this quarantine If you ask that question versus are you against this quarantine? So just that simple word change you'd get different percentages. So the wording of the questions matter, and also the order of questions matters. So let's say we're interested in how people feel about Second Amendment rights. You wouldn't want to ask a question right before that about mass shootings. So if you ask about mass shootings and then ask about Second Amendment rights, you're going to change the percentage of people who support Second Amendment rights. So the order of questions or the wording of questions can greatly affect the true way someone being surveyed feels. So again, be sure to read. This is a great section, 1.5. Do me a favor, read the whole thing. There's also a weird term, sampling error and non-sampling error. I hate the fact that they use the word error. Error means like mistake. So let's say, remember, we're trying to see how a population feels. We're trying to see how a population feels. So we take a sample, and based on that sample, we'll extrapolate that out to the population. So whenever you're doing that, there's just basic sampling error. So this is just normally what happens. We're not talking to the whole population. We're just talking to a sample. And so we're going to get sampling error. That's normal. That's fine. The problem is non-sampling error. So these situations, these are all non-sampling errors. So whenever the interviewer is bad or the wording of the question is bad, you're messing things up. You're creating non-sampling errors. Confusing, I know. Sampling error, that's just mathematically what happens when everything's fine. You take a sample, you're trying to extrapolate it out to a population. You're going to get some sampling error. No big deal. Non-sampling error is your sample's not good, and then your response bias is probably there, so you're just messing things up. So non-sampling error can be prevented. This can't be prevented. This is just what happens because we can't talk to the whole population. Okay, so again, be sure to read this whole section. This was a good one. Smiley face.